I am a junior psychologist here at PCL, and one of the tools I love that we do here is Profile Match 2. So when we were given the opportunity to run a webinar series and I was going to get involved, I was really excited to be able to share this with people, and sort of jumped on the opportunity to run this as a presentation. So we'll jump right in, if I can. Here we go. And let me pop this up to the top. One moment, minor technical issues, here we go. Okay, so the main challenge for employers when they come to try and recruit somebody new for a position is that they're trying to capture a wide variety of work behaviours. In any one role, there's a lot of behaviours that job will demand of its employer, of the person who's going to fill that vacancy. And if you sort of expand that out to a lot of different kind of vacancies, there's a massive, almost endless list of job behaviours you'd want someone to carry out. So if the person's trying to do the assessment during a recruitment procedure, it becomes very difficult because there are so many behaviours you need to try and account for in the people that you're assessing. So instead of HR departments trying to account for this massive swathe of behaviours, they bundle those into competencies, behaviours that are fairly similar. They put together into competencies, and that then becomes the foundation that recruitment, development, and other HR functions sort of are based in. To represent that visually then for a moment, on one end here we have job behaviours, and this is only a very small portion of what would be a huge list if it were to be extensive. And you can see also we recognise in there several different behaviours that are required in your job, other jobs, and you can imagine how large those would be as well. But you'll also spot that there are similarities within several components of that list. And so we can then bundle them together into a smaller, finite list of competencies, and makes the whole approach to things like recruitment far more manageable. From there, the challenge then becomes, how do we measure these competencies? We know what we want to assess in our candidates, but how do we do it? One very popular approach, and it's used by almost most companies that we know of, is an interview. To have an interview process where you invite people in, you talk to them, you try and uncover what they've done in the past and how effective they can be at fulfilling competencies for a role. However, the issue with this is that we bring some unconscious biases with us to the table. Things like the halo and recency effect. So the halo effect is where someone makes a positive first impression that has a subsequent impact on every other impression that the interviewer would make of that person, which from the candidate side is why we make so much effort to try and make sure that we look presentable on the day to make that positive first impression. But from the side of the employer, you want to try and make yourself as fair and objective as possible and try to avoid these biases. So that's one thing that could possibly taint the waters of having an interview. Another thing there is a recency effect, which is exactly what it says on the tin. If you have 15 candidates come in for interviews, and then the next day you're going to do a bit of a wash up with yourself and try and compare them and compare notes, who do you think would be best? The people that you had most recently, i.e. towards the end of that list, they're going to be more prominent in your mind, and they're going to receive, again, this unconscious, unintentional, but preferential treatment when you come to thinking about your candidates. Another way we try and measure competencies is to look at CVs or do background checks, see what the people have done before, and see if that's representative of the competencies you require for this role. However, again, it's not that these things shouldn't be done. We have to be very cautious of the biases that come with this. You have a similar to me bias, where people that have a similar education background or a similar name, again, are given this unconscious preferential treatment when we start to analyse other components of their CV. And if you're trying to remain as objective as possible, you want to avoid that within your recruitment process. Plus, both of these things are time consuming for employers. Both of them take time and effort to go through. And if you're going to do that and to then find out afterwards that actually there could have been a better way of doing it, you'll be frustrated. So measuring competencies can be complex, but I'll tell you what I've noticed about complex things is that with time, as technologies become more prominent in everything that we do, a lot of different tasks, products and services have become far more widely available than they previously have been. The complexity is still there within these tasks or within these services, but it's taken behind the scenes where it's technologically managed. And what we're presented with as users is a really nice, easy and simple to use interface. I'll give you 3 quick examples. One would be the camera. Cameras used to be these large, chunky things and then blockage, and you had to know how to manage all of the components within it, make sure they were all maintained, make sure you know what the aperture was going to be, the exposure, and so on, to then end up taking a single photo. Whereas now with digital cameras, it's all done instantaneously for you and behind the scenes. The physics is still the same. You still want to get the light of a visual field onto a small lens inside a camera and to take a photo of that. But everything in there, like the exposure and the aperture and the contrast, it's all managed for you. So anyone can take a good looking photograph. Secondly is navigation. You look back at sort of just any maps and sort of OS maps and things like that. It's a swathe of different lines and colors and dots and writing. And you have to be able to understand how to interpret that to then know firstly where you are, where you want to get to is, and then how to plot that route. And then you have to remember that or have notes of it so that as you're undertaking that route, either by foot or by car, you can navigate it appropriately. Whereas of course now, most of us, unless maybe perhaps you're going for a hike somewhere in the Cotswolds or something, you wouldn't crack out an OS map. We all have satellite navigation. It plots for you the fastest route. It updates with things like traffic as well. And then all we do is just follow the route. And lastly for me is communications. So when we used to have switchboards, of course, you used to have these giant machines wired into a house. You have to pick them up, know what number to call. It goes through to a person. You have to tell that person the information of the person you want to talk to. They then connect you and you get through. Lengthy, plus you require physical manning of stations to require that to work each time you need to undertake communication. Whereas instead now, we have the world of communication at our fingertips through smartphones, and anybody else in the world who has a similar device, we can connect to instantaneously. So this progression from complex to, at least on the user side of things, relatively simple, is also the same on for personality. That is what we're going to come on to as the solution for our recruitment issue. Personality is complex. It tries to cover a lot of the human condition, the things that make us different from one another, but also the similarities we have between each other. Because it tries to cover so much, trying to pin down exactly what it is, what personality is fairly hard. Across centuries, there's been debates among philosophers, and across several decades now, again, heated debate between psychologists backed by a lot of research. There's a lot of research out there on personality. What this has led to is a relative consensus. It's not complete consensus. There's always a bone to pick somewhere in academia, but relative consensus that personality is underpinned by 5 core factors, 5 main pillars seem to uphold what we consider personality to be. The way this has been sort of produced and come across is what we call a lexical model. So the assumption is if there's a word we need to describe a person, or if there's something about a person that is worth capturing, that we need to describe to someone else, there's a word for that. And if there isn't, we've invented a word for it. So across time, as our lexicon has grown and grown and grown, we have this variety of words we can use to describe people. And again, I've taken just a small selection of those words over there on the left. What we then do is we ask people to rate either themselves or others on a scale, you know, how, for example, how careful is this person? How punctual is this person? And so on. And we factor analyze that. Very in a similar fashion to how we did bundling before with competencies, we factor analyze the results we get from these data set we get on language ratings. And what we land on is a 5-factor model. So when people rate either themselves or others on these words, the scores tend to cluster and be very similar in 5 sort of main heat spots. And those are the 5 factors of personality being agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, extroversion, and openness. And those are, as our CEO here has described, as being, he says, they're the primary colours of personality. Personality assessment, then, how we assess that is objective and it's consistent. Plus, personality is related to job demands. We know that, for example, if you were to be a doctor, you could have all the professional medical knowledge you need to undertake that role. But if you're somebody who is not very sensitive when it comes to interpersonal relations, it's going to be difficult for that doctor, or at least difficult for their patients, to receive bad news from that doctor, or someone who has more of an intuitive nature towards being sensitive and breaking bad news. That's the kind of person you'd want to have on a medical team to break bad news to patients. However, the way that psychologists talk about personality is sort of within their own language. Given the decades of debate and research, we managed to pin down what personality is, but the way we then address that and discuss it and talk about it is very specialist. We talk about predispositions and we talk about tendencies, and the language we use to talk about people doesn't map onto the language we use in the workplace, which, as we discussed earlier, is sort of rooted in competencies. So instead then, what we need is to have a psychologist bridge that gap. So we've gone from this objective approach where we have personality assessment and we bring a psychologist in to transpose. They have a foot in both camps and they can translate from one to the other. The issue there is that we're introducing again that reliance on judgment that we're hoping to get away from in addressing the recruitment procedures. Plus, the issue with having psychologists do the interpretation, well, an issue, is that it's going to be different each time. One psychologist will interpret a profile slightly differently to another psychologist. And from one report to the next, the same psychologist may vary a little bit from each to each, because as they gain experience, they're going to influence what their judgment then becomes in interpreting a report. So it's very hard, retrospectively, to then assess how valid that can be, how valid the interpretation process has been. Here we go, sorry. Let's go back into the mainframe, here we go. Instead then, if we could commoditize personality, if we could view it through a lens of personality, we remove the necessity to have a psychologist interpret everything for us. Suddenly, at that point, a personality assessment would be accessible by anybody that understood the language of competencies, which is every employer, and it would become widely available to many, many people. So that then is what triggered PCL to create what we call competency metrics. We wanted to represent competencies or competency fit as a combination of personalities building blocks, so then each person can take a personality assessment and the report comes out as being competency fit per competency based on what their typical behaviours are like as via personality reports. To refer back to these two images then quickly, what we see on one side of this scale, on the language side, I don't know if my camera is flipped or not, but for me on the left-hand side we have language. So we have this vast variety of words we use to describe people, but we factor analyse those down and we get to 5 core factors of personality. On the other end, we have a vast variety of job behaviours, which again, too many for us to measure, so instead we bundle those down into a select number of competencies. The challenge for competency metrics in our program called Profile Match is to match these up, to try and spot which components of personality are likely to be behind someone's fit per competency. So that was the challenge. As to how we do that, we had to first establish our guiding principles, to sort of set the ground rules before we start and know where we're going, and then to clearly define the relationships between both the competencies and the personality components so that we're very transparent and clear on what we're trying to do and what we're setting out to achieve. And then number 3 is then program those, turn them into algorithms and objectively, rigorously test them to see if they really do hold up. So that's what we did. The guiding principles, the first one is that there are 5 factors of personality. We're happy to accept that there are 5 factors for 5 main sort of core pillars that uphold personality. Those factors influence a range of workplace behaviours. The reason I use the word influence there is because, we said a moment ago, having doctor as an example, their knowledge and skills are also clearly fundamental to them carrying out their job. Having a great personality to be a doctor without having done medical training wouldn't hold up. But personality does carry a large amount of influence on how well they can carry out that role. Number 3 then, so if workplace behaviours can be explained by personality, then competencies, the combination of those, should be able to be explained by combining the 5 factors in a variety of ways. In the same way that our CEO here, Jeff Trickey, explains the 5 factors of personality being the primary colours of personality, the primary colours on colour spectrum have to be mixed and melded together to be able to see and understand the entire spectrum of light. The 5 factors of personality have to be taken into consideration in context of each other to understand fully how and why someone would behave in a certain way. Number 5, if factors are split in smaller pieces, robustness decreases. So again, the analogy with pillars, if you were to take bricks out of a pillar, the structural sort of integrity there would start to decrease. for us here, if we start to take just pieces of the 5 factors rather than the whole thing together, the scientific rigidity behind it also decreases. On the flip side of that, however, sorry, I put someone else in. On the flip side of that, however, if we blend factors together, bring pillars together, we increase the number of items, increase robustness and stability, all while simultaneously allowing ourselves to capture nuance that we'd otherwise miss by looking at a single factor alone. So again, getting that contextual knowledge of one factor in relation to another uncovers so much more than anyone would singularly. When it came to creation then, we needed to first identify the links between personality and the competencies that we're looking at. So we had psychologists with decades of experience in varying industries and roles to really hash it out over which personality components are likely to sit behind certain competencies. And then on to point 2, the nature of those relationships. Is it as somebody's emotional sensitivity increases, they get better at being sensitive to the needs of others, or is it that as one goes up, the other comes down, and so on? So all of these things are discussed and tried to be uncovered. And step 3 is to make sure you revise the definitions of the competencies to reflect that personality content. Because for anyone coming in to then use this tool at the end of it, we want them to be able to know exactly what we're trying to tap into, sort of under the hood of profile match. So, and you'll see later on, I'll show you how you can access that. So if you want to spend your own time, you can go through these definitions and see exactly which components we are saying are behind certain competencies. Once that's been established and we've sort of decided and come to agreement on what should sit where, we then need to try and turn that into algorithms. So we take the relationships from step 2 and sort of the above bit, and we express them as an algorithm. And as point 5 then says here, we need to then make sure we weight those appropriately. So we might have agreeableness and extroversion as 2 personality factors behind a competency, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're both equally influential. It might be that one of them is highly influential, so we give it a weighting of say 80%, whereas the other might be less so we give it 20%, or so on. So we make sure that the weighting of each is accurately reflected. And then in point 6, you check those distributions. With personality data, we know that things are normally distributed. So we know that some people are very low on extroversion, some are very high, and a lot are in the middle, and so on. So we get a bell curve, we get a distribution that's normally distributed. And we know that, you know, for example, if we were to talk about someone's sociability at work, not everybody is super sociable, but on the same regard, not everybody is incredibly non-sociable. So instead, when we run these when we say this bit at the end, we're going to test it, we test the personality data through the algorithms to see how the competency fit distribution lands, and we can see where everyone is. And if it doesn't look quite right, we can adjust it until it does look right. Which brings us on to some of the benefits with competency metrics. The first one here is it fits in with existing procedures. The fact that it's all spoken about in a language of competencies allows us to slot that into a variety of HR functions, competency-based interviews, competency-based appraisals. Everything that we have there, the language of these reports now is going to fit in exactly with these procedures, easily allowing anyone in any HR department the ability to gain control over the insight that personality reports have to offer. Number 2 is that the report has a specific focus. Traditionally, personality reports will show you the entirety of someone's personality within a report. So they get those 5 factors and they try to explain the entire spectrum of that person's personality, that sort of colour spectrum. And instead, because not all of it's going to be, so all that will be specifically relevant to each role. Whereas here, because we're only choosing the competencies that we see as being directly relevant to the roles we're going to be recruiting for, the assessment report only reports on those competencies. So 100% of the report content has an applied relevance to the role you're currently recruiting for. Number 3 is that the interpretation process becomes as accountable as the assessment. So like I was saying earlier on, when we had the assessments that developed over decades of research and debate, and they sort of come to this point because of the rigor behind them, and then we have a psychologist interpret them, which isn't going to be the same every time. Now, that interpretation process will be the same every time because it's going through the same algorithmic procedures, which allows us to do actually 2 things. One, it makes it accountable and fair and robust. But secondly, it allows us to reflect back afterwards and see how valid this is. I'm going to come on to a few case studies later on. We'll see where we do exactly that. We want to validate and see how good, how effective this has been. So we'll come on to that later on. And that's point 3. Point 4 is all candidates treated the same way because of that accountability, because of that fairness and the repetitive, not repetitive, but the consistent, better word, nature of competency metrics. Every candidate is treated the same way, regardless of race, creed, age, name, educational background. They go through the same process. And number 5 is that algorithms can be refined and developed. So what's going on under the hood of competency metrics can only ever be improved with time. We also came across some unexpected benefits. So we expected those ones on the previous slide, but here we sort of uncovered some things as we were going through the process that we sort of didn't think or didn't spot ahead of time. The first one is being able to capture non-linear relationships. What that means is, as you go up on a personality factor, it might not necessarily mean that it continually strengthens someone's competency fit. There might be too much of a good thing, kind of as an idiom. To put it into, we call it a U-shaped function, and I was speaking to a friend the other day about this presentation and talking them through it, and he mentioned 2 people we used to work with. So we went to school together, and in the holidays we would work for a mobile catering company, and it was always a different team most times you worked, because it was different kids from different parts of, when they were free in the holidays. But there were 2 people that he reminded me of. One of them was would do anything to try and avoid any social scenario. So when we would go to an event and serve, often it was canapes followed by a meal. So when it came to the canapes, you couldn't find them. We joked that it was like playing hide and seek continually, because you wouldn't see this person for like an hour. And then you'd stumble across them, and they'd managed to find the room in the, wherever the event's being held, the room with the least number of people, and they've kind of, found a corner, but they're not going to have to approach too many parties to try and serve anything. And of course, that means they weren't serving much food at the start. Meanwhile, the other person we used to work with was the polar opposite. When it came to serving the main meals, they didn't really enjoy it that much, because you had to just serve a plate back to the kitchen, get a plate, serve a plate back to the kitchen, and there's no time for interaction. Whereas during the sort of the pre-meal sort of snacks and food and things, drinks and snacks, they loved it. You just see them just meander through the crowds of guests that are at these events, talking to people continually. If they happened to serve a canapé, that was like a bonus on the side. They just thrived off of this social energy. But because of that, they just did not care how well they were doing their job. They didn't care if they were serving food or not. They just liked being around people, sort of inserting themselves into social groups and having a conversation. So for both of those people, it's their level of sociability which is influencing their performance, whereas one of them has far too much of it, the other had far too little. And so there's sort of a Goldilocks zone in the middle, where for hospitality, in that circumstance, it would be a mid-range of sociability that would suit the role best. So that's the non-linear relationships. That's the kind of thing we're able to capture here that we aren't traditionally with other kinds of methods. Number 2 is a combination of scale providing the larger knowledge base for interpretation. So we spoke before about combining those pillars to uncover some nuance, taking one factor into consideration within context of another. When we do that, within the decades of research within personality, psychologists therefore have a large knowledge base behind each of those factors. If we're combining them together to describe how well someone fits a competency, then when it comes to us writing that interpretive text for the reports, we have a larger knowledge base for writing up how the algorithms should be interpreting the data and how that should then be described in the report. Number 3 is that everything becomes user-friendly. Because everything's now written and processed in terms of competencies, both the system that we set these things up through and the reports that come out the other end are understandable to any employer. It's so digestible because we've cut out all of the babble that we used to have as psychologists, which makes sense to us, but it's very niche. And now we cut through that and we get straight to the point and we make it with competency-friendly language. Number 4 is that the score range far exceeds usual competency scales. So competencies are popular, especially when it comes to things like appraisals within businesses. But usually what that means is it's somebody who gets their managerial rating on a scale of 1 to 5, but even then, people don't like using the extremes. So really a manager's going to rate you between 2, 3, and 4. To really ultimately have a 3-point scale being rated on. If people will get 3, it's hard to tease them apart as different employees to say the talent pipelining or whatever we've got coming up. In this case, the full range of scores is 45 points. So you can see far more nuance in the gradations along that scale. I'll show you later on as well. We're going to see some sample reports, and you'll see how what we've done within that is to compress that down into a 10-point scale, sort of for the sake of ease in interpreting it. But you are able to still at least see and spot and utilize, if you want to, that level of precision. So in the same way that all of these previous technologies like cameras, navigation, and communication have been simplified through the use of technology, and actually, in the modern day case, into a single device, into a smartphone for all of us, the complexity of the world of job behaviours and the complexity of the world of personality have been simultaneously simplified and been made explicitly accessible to people through competency metrics and through our tool here, Profile Match 2. So I'm going to show you quickly now what Profile Match looks like for you to use. What we will do when we send you, sorry, my mum to make this full screen. Here we go. When we send you out the post-course or the post-webinar email, you will get a link to this as well as getting a link to the recording of today's session. But on here, this is what you see if you go to profilematchassessments.com. This is the home page. Down the bottom here, you can see there is a registry link. It's free to register for an account, so you can send us a register request. We can set up with an account within the same day usually, and you can hit the ground running. For today though, I'm going to show you what you can also do if you want to sort of see what's going on inside before you register for an account. If you click on this Explore function up the top, it'll take you inside Profile Match, and this is what it looks like. Now, before we go anywhere else, I'm going to show you some bits at the top here. One of these things says Library Competencies. That is a PDF which has every competency we have within the system with an extensive definition. I mentioned a moment ago how it's important to be transparent with what it is that's going on behind each competency. And if you want to find out more about what each competency really is being defined as, that's where you find it, is up within that Library Competencies block there. Next to it, we also have My Resources. From here, you can see a price list, so you can see how much reports in the Profile Match system cost. You can also see sample reports, so you can then compare and contrast each of those different reports as well, but I'm going to show you a couple in a moment. And there's also manuals. Within the manuals section, there are two manuals, a technical manual and a user manual. The user manual guides you through how to use the system online. So once you're registered, you can use the user manual to familiarize yourself with how it works, how you order reports and so on. And the technical manual is essentially more transparency behind exactly what Profile Match does. So if the bits I've spoken to you about today are interesting to you, sort of like about how it's developed and how competencies, how personality factors sit behind certain competencies, you'll find out more in the technical manual about exactly what the science behind Profile Match 2 is. So this is the page where we see the competencies of each of these small grey boxes. These are competencies within Profile Match. As we select them for a role we may have coming up, we'll see they turn coloured, and they will then be the ones we're going to use in our report generation. Next to each competency, we also have a small I. If you hover over it, you'll get a revised, smaller definition of each competency, which again will then be expanded upon in the library competencies at the top. Within here, we also have templates for sort of common roles that Profile Match tend to be used for. So we have a sales role, whereby the competencies would then look like this. We have these 7 competencies that are highly associated with performance among salespeople. And if we go to then just say, let's say marketing, you'll see that switch again. So you can go through those templates and sort of see if those fit you, or you can bespokely design your own. The cap on the number of competencies you can have for any one report is 10. So if you go over 10, the system will allow you to select more than 10 on this screen, but as you then go to generate a report, it'll ask you to only cap your number of competencies at 10. Once you've selected the competencies you want, so let's say we are going to, in this example, take a marketing position. Down in the bottom right, you'll see we can then get the report generation. Now, here we do have, sorry, someone's in the waiting room. Here we go. We do have development reports and 360 reports. Now, we're going to do a webinar later in the year, sort of uncovering more of the utility of Profile Match and the variety of reports within the system. But for today, seeing we're focused on recruitment so far, I'm just going to go into the selection reports. If you have questions about the other reports, feel free to drop us an email or to look in the user manual and to look at the sample reports. We're more than happy to discuss things further with you. But for today, we're just going to look at some of the selection reports. So for example, in this marketing role, let's go for the sifting report now. What it first gives you is a little box up here which just says that there are certain competencies within this selection that have similarities, have overlap. Doesn't mean that they're the same, it just means that the personality components behind them are similar, but it's things like the weighting will be different. There will be nuance there. The only reason we give you that warning is that if you've done a bespoke template and you have 10 competencies, if 2 do overlap, there may be another one you'd like to swap that out for before you generate the report. But for now, we're happy to have both of those in there. So we can look at the reports. Oh, sorry, I've got boxes in the way. Oops, let's try it again. There we go. So this is what the sifting report looks like. You have the name of the participant here, which is Sophie Sample, a brief introduction as to what the report is and what the report does. And then you get this graphic. So on the side, you can see the names of the competencies we've chosen, which in this case were the competencies for the marketing template. And then you get that person's competency fit score on a level of 1 to 10, with 1 being a poor match and 10 being a good match or a good fit. And you can see that we have a number for each within each of those blocks, but the way that the coloured bar fills a certain part of each block, that refers back to that 45-point scale I was referring to earlier, so you can really detect that nuance, but it's been simplified into a 10-point scale just for the sake of simplicity and understanding. Having looked then at the person's overall match, either per competency and overall, as we then scroll down in the sifting report, we also get sort of a few questions that would be suggested by the profile match system for you to then possibly take into an interview, so that you have sort of, again, this evidence-based and consistently similar interview questions for each of your candidates. We also do, and I'll show you it quickly now, an interview guide report, which is far more extensive than this, if you would like assistance in using someone's personality profile going into an interview. If I go into the interview guide, and we're okay with that as well. This is the Profile Match 2 interview guide report. As we go into here, again, we get now a longer introduction to what the report does, because in this case, it wants to let you know exactly how interview questions become triggered, why they're being asked in a certain way, and why they're relevant to both your candidates and to those competencies. As we scroll down, you still get this sort of one-page summary, so you can see somebody's results on that one graphic, so you get a graphic bar chart. And then as you come down, it's broken up page by page. You get a page per competency, where you have someone's fit, again, reinstated at the top, and then different questions that are aimed at tapping into sort of subcomponents of those competencies within an interview. So you can sort of choose out of those sort of, again, subcomponents, which would be more important to you or more important to the role, and then use that to really make the most of any interview time you get. Because it requires both effort and time as an investment for an employer to take anyone to interviews. You want to make the most out of it. So what we're trying to do here is to allow anyone, even without previous personality experience, to utilize a personality report in an interview context. So that's a brief introduction to the profile match system. And there is also, as you come onto it, it will probably trigger you and remind you, we have a mobile app as well that you can use. So you can access everything you have with profile match on the go as well. So once you get familiar with the system, it's very quick to use, very easy to use, and you can do it as and when you commute. For those of you who are still commuting. So that's a brief introduction to Profile Match 2. I'm going to quickly touch on now putting that theory into practice. It's all very well and good me sitting here telling you that it's absolutely fantastic. But we need to check 2 things really. Firstly, is if competency metrics really represent someone's competency fit. And so for that, I'm going to give you this case study here. Several years ago, HMRC approached PCL with 7 competencies that they were using. And so they would use personality profiling, but also have it again be in that digestible format. So we use competency metric scores to generate a fit score per participant. And there was a big sample of over 800 people. And within that massive sample, HMRC also picked out a select few people. And they said, well, these are the people that we see as just being exemplary. Like they really sort of are what we expect to see of people that carry out these competencies to the max. So we have correlations of their ratings along with their competency fit scores, and there's a correlation score of 0.46. So what that means in terms of those of you who might not be familiar with sort of statistics and correlations, they vary from 0 to 1, and 0.46 is the kind of score we'd expect for something that is valid. So this confirms the fact that the competency fit scores we're getting from competency metrics really is reflective and indicative of how good a fit these people had for those competencies within the role. And if you're interested as well in these, I will give you our contact information at the end. But what we do have, these results have been published in the past. So if this is the kind of thing, again, that interests you, do get in touch and we can share with you more on these case studies and more on the research that's gone behind validating competency metrics and profile match. The second case study I want to share with you is finding out, so we know with that first step then, the competency metrics really do capture someone's competency fit. But the question then is there any direct bottom line, tangible benefits for an employer in using that system? There was a large UK retailer who again approached PCL. They wanted a really efficient process for how they could select high-performing sales staff for their departments across the country. We used Profile Match 2 to determine which competencies would most likely predict high sales performance. And you saw earlier on we had the sales template. Those were the competencies that we used for this company to sort of determine who would be best suited for their sales roles. The outcome was that the candidates, their staff who were recruited using Profile Match 2 on average had 10% higher in their sales figures than their colleagues who were not recruited using Profile Match. And it's that kind of result to me, it's just sort of staggering as to how insightful personality assessment can be. And if you put that in the hands of every employer, the benefits can be sort of utilised by far more companies than they currently are. To summarise and sort of recap on a few of these points, organisations talk in terms of competencies. Meanwhile, personality assessments are typically talked about in terms of the psychological language. And if we could convert personality to be competency friendly, then you remove the need for a psychologist, remove the reliance we have on psychologists. And at that point, the reports become understandable. They also become cheaper because you don't need to pay a psychologist to spend a few hours interpreting it for you. Faster, because again, you remove that human process, that human step, and widely accessible. It isn't anybody that can now afford the services of a psychologist. It's any employer that can access the benefits of personality profiling and the insights that these reports can offer. This new approach is something that we haven't seen elsewhere, and it's something that allows personality to be robust, the personality interpretation process to be robust, accountable, and it can help you recruit your next employee objectively and fairly. So that's the presentation. Thank you very much for sticking with me as we've gone through.